Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going over my top 5 books that I read in 2020. Let's get started. Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds? This is the opening question to my favorite book that I read last year, Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. One of the best-known works in Russian literature, this book was first published in 1866, and at the time, Dostoevsky was going through a collapse in his own personal life. His wife and his brother had both recently died. His business was going under due to debt. He was sentenced to the debtor's prison, and he was even selling his clothes and begging his friends for money in order to pay his hotel bills. In a letter to his publishers asking for an advance on his new books, he describes a law student in St. Petersburg named Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov has found himself in abject poverty, and he no longer has enough money to continue his studies. However, although he's short on money, he's both handsome and intelligent. He's resentful of his low position in society, despite his talent and his intellect, and he objects to involving himself in work which he sees as a waste of his time and his abilities. He's convinced himself that people who are moral only do so because they're uncourageous and fearful, and that true power is taken by those people who are brave enough to overstep the illusory and outdated instincts of morals and religion. His mother and his sister write to him from back home to tell him how proud they are of him for pursuing his career. However, it's obvious from their letter that they're worse off than even he is, borrowing money to send him, which is squandered. And his sister tells him that she's even intending to marry a local businessman despite the fact that he treats their mother badly in order for him to be able to pay off Raskolnikov's debts. Driven by his desperation and tormented by his nihilistic outlook on life, after selling the last of his valuables to a wicked old pawnbroker, he creates a plan to murder her and take her belongings for himself. However, although he confesses in the courts, Raskolnikov still believes in his heart that the only reason that he was unsuccessful is because he failed to keep up his story, and he sees his confession not as a genuine admission of guilt, but simply as an act of weakness. His conscience, according to him, is merely the dead weight of instinct, which he was not strong enough to overcome. He goes to prison, and it's there that he realizes that in order to truly find peace and free himself from his guilt, he must acknowledge that he's bound by laws that operate outside the realm of rationality and science, and that he messes with those laws at his peril. In the end, life steps into the place of theory for Raskolnikov, and he finds a new source of overwhelming joy, redemption, and happiness. Dostoevsky set out in this book to answer a deeply moral question that gets to the heart of what it means to be a human. In a modern society that's driven by rationalism and science, what happens to us if we decide that our inherited traditions and beliefs no longer apply to us? It's the best investigation that I know of what happens to a society when the notion is accepted that there is nothing truly divine about the individual, and that the world is simply a zero-sum game in which the only thing that matters is power. My favorite quote from the book is in the epilogue, and it's a section that I call The Dream. He dreamt that a terrible strange new plague had come from the depths of Asia. Some sort of new microbe was attacking people's bodies, but these microbes were endowed with intelligence and will. Never had men considered themselves so intellectual, in possession of the truth. Whole towns and people were driven mad by the infection. Everyone was excited and did not understand one another. They did not know how to judge and could not agree what to consider evil and what good. They did not know who to blame or justify. They gathered together armies, but even on the march, the armies would begin attacking each other. Who was summoning them? No one knew. Ordinary trades were abandoned. They accused one another, fought and killed each other. There were conflagrations and famine, and all men and all things were involved in this destruction. Crime and Punishment is unparalleled in its psychological depth. It's my favorite book, and I would highly recommend it to anybody that's willing to give it a read. I started this next book on my list around the same time that the initial COVID lockdown mandates first began. Work had stopped, schools were closed, gyms and stores were all shut down, and the world was on hold. I wanted to stop and take a moment to examine my life. Nietzsche said that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl directly addresses this issue. Frankl was a neurologist and a psychiatrist who spent 3 years of imprisonment in the Nazi concentration camps during World War II. His wife, his father, his brother, and his mother all died in the concentration camps. he faced extreme hunger, debilitating illness, and the brutal living conditions that killed an estimate of nearly 20 million people. Frankl describes the numbing emotional experience that the prisoners faced with the normalization of torture and death that characterized daily life in the camps. However, during his time in imprisonment, he took the opportunity to study his own experience and those of the other prisoners, coming to the conclusion that forces beyond his control could take away everything from him except for one thing: the ability to choose how he responded in any situation. What hit me so hard reading Frankl's story was that it was no mystery to him why people died in the camps. Death and suffering were so frequent that they became commonplace. What he was trying to figure out was how the hell anybody could actually survive in those conditions. He observed that some prisoners who were more physically capable of surviving would become resentful, nihilistic, and inevitably would be the first to die. Instead of taking the difficult experiences of camp life as a test of their inner strength, they chose rather to reject their lives and despised their own circumstances. Their death was caused not so much by a lack of food or medicine, but by a lack of hope and something to live for. On the other hand, he found that those who remained hopeful for the future and saw their time in camp as an opportunity and a challenge to be overcome were more likely to recover from their illness and ultimately to survive. This was the primary source of his development of what Viktor Frankl called the will to meaning. How I understand it, Viktor Frankl considers the main concern for us as humans as not consisting in the gratification of our instincts or our desires, but in the fulfilling of a meaning that's determined by our experiences. Instead of looking at life through the lens of an existential vacuum, Frankl claims that we can discover the meaning in our own lives by creating a work or doing a deed, by experiencing something or encountering someone, or by attitudes that we adopt towards unavoidable suffering. The pleasure that we seek in our everyday lives is actually a byproduct of meaning, and it's destroyed to the degree that it's made a goal in and of itself. My favorite quote from the book is, "Freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of personal responsibility." This book is deep, it's easy to read at just about 165 pages, and it is an excellent personal account into the absolute necessity of personal sovereignty and responsibility. Okay, after reading Dostoevsky, I was so affected by his style and the depth of his writing that I wanted to seek out other Russian authors. Enter number 3 on my list, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. War and Peace is a novel about the French invasion of Russia in 1812. It's an epic work consisting of almost 1,200 pages, almost 600,000 words, and just over 550 individual characters. This is one of the first books in a while that I was nervous to take off the shelf. I have a rule that I have to finish every book that I start. So I crossed my fingers, I poured myself a cup of coffee, I sat down in my chair, and I started the literary marathon that Tolstoy wrote back in the 1860s. Tolstoy had originally set out to write a trilogy of short books chronicling the attempted overthrow of Tsar Nicholas I by a group of military officers known as the Decembrists. However, when he began to investigate the events that led up to the insurgency, he found himself traveling further and further back in time into Russian history, and he was captivated by the Napoleonic War, specifically the invasion of Moscow in 1812, which became his sole focus. There's no main character in this book, so there's no central plot line or narrative structure to follow. Instead, I found myself oscillating back and forth between different characters from Russian and French society and the battles between Napoleon's army and Russia. This diffusion of a singular narrative is actually, in my opinion, one of the central themes that Tolstoy is trying to get across. In the beginning of the book, Russia is actually in the middle of a war. However, the first chapter begins with an elaborate soiree held by prominent figures of the aristocracy in St. Petersburg. People of the highest distinction fill the halls, eating, dancing, and enjoying the company of those in attendance. The war is an afterthought for them. Before dinner, Napoleon is briefly mentioned, but the subject is quickly changed. In fact, Napoleon was actually a popular figure in Russia at the time, seen as a symbol of liberation and freedom for his role in the recent revolution in France, and some of the key characters in the book actually defend him and idolize him. However, at the end of the book, Napoleon reaches the capital of Moscow and is unimpeded by the Russian forces from taking over the city. The war is over, and Napoleon actually calls for peace. But it's not until the fighting has actually stopped that the pain and destruction begins for the members of the upper class. Their markets and places of worship are pillaged, they abandon their homes, and they flee their city. Tolstoy interjects throughout the book, asking key fundamental questions that would frame the events that would take place in the story. For instance, what is power? He observed that after events take place, historians come in after the fact with cunningly devised explanations and evidences for the foresight that led to the battle's victory. But the leaders of those battles are actually the least independent and the most constricted in their actions. For instance, Napoleon is the symbol of the French invasion of Russia, and Tolstoy notes that history attributes his actions to the success of that event. Tolstoy questions whether or not the overthrow of Moscow had anything to do with Napoleon at all. Napoleon didn't take up arms in the battle, and it's believed that he never killed an enemy soldier during the war. All that was done by his soldiers. Those soldiers may have chosen to follow his command, but they were driven individually by their own purposes and desires for doing so. The initial battles that took place led to the inevitable desire to continue to fight, and if Napoleon had forbidden them to fight the Russians, they would have put him to death and continued on with the war. Tolstoy makes the claim that the war was not dependent on Napoleon at all. Instead, he believed that it proceeded from the wills of the hundreds of thousands of individual men that took part in it. In the book he writes, on what condition are the wills of the masses vested in one person? On condition that that person expresses the wills of the masses. I love this book. I will definitely be reading it again in the future, and I would highly recommend it. In the 1950s, there was a small fishing port off the coast of Malaysia, about half the size of Rhode Island. There were no natural resources, no defense infrastructure, and a population of roughly 1 million people in a third world society suffering from cultural and racial division and unrest. But what if I told you now that same country is now a first world oasis with the third highest GDP per capita in the world? This is the story of Singapore and how the country went from third world to first, told by the founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was elected as Singapore's first Prime Minister in 1955 as the country became liberated from colonization by Britain. However, as the old problems of Imperial British rule were coming to an end, Singapore's problems were only beginning. By 1965, Singapore was asked to leave its union with Malaysia, leaving them with no defense system, no economic resources, and the raging social tensions that led to the race riots between the Chinese Malay populations and the increasing threat of communist insurgencies. Yu and his colleagues had no desire to rewrite their past by creating new currencies, renaming buildings and streets, or tearing down buildings that the British had established during its rule. The way he saw it, their history was a part of who they were, for worse and for better, and the important thing was how the new government was going to proceed going forward. With an ever-growing population looking for work, and the rise of globalization and the advent of new technologies, Lee Kuan Yew set out to create what he called an oasis in the developing world to attract American multinational corporations. He believed that if Singapore could establish first world standards in services, health, education, communications, transportation, and services, that it would become a base camp for professionals that wanted to do business in the region. However, this change was not going to happen on its own. Lee Kuan Yew came to understand that personal motivations and personal rewards were essential for the building and sustaining of a productive economy. He knew that a winner-take-all society, like what existed in Hong Kong, would not be acceptable to Singaporeans. He saw the importance of creating, in his words, a fair but not welfare society. He began by giving every citizen a stake in the country and its future. He believed that if every family owned a home, then the country would be more stable. He was determined to avoid placing the burden of the present generation's welfare cost onto the next generation. This goal led to the creation of the CPF, or the Central Provident Fund, a compulsory comprehensive savings and pension plan for working Singaporeans and for permanent residents, primarily for their retirement, healthcare, and housing needs. Obviously, this goes against many of the values that modern democratic societies often take for granted. However, as with most of the policies that you implemented, context is everything. At the time, Singapore was an impoverished country with a population that was largely uneducated, with growing needs for modern healthcare, affordable housing, retirement funds, and social security. Yu established a solution to this problem based on the Confucian values of yin and yang, establishing a competitive balance in the marketplace and the need for social solidarity and cohesion. Another key objective for Lee Kuan Yew was to clean up Singapore's system of government. He believed that human ingenuity is infinite in its ability to translate power and discretion into personal gain. To change this paradigm, he identified two major components that needed to change. Number one was that candidates must not need large sums of money in order to get elected into office, otherwise it starts a self-perpetuating cycle of corruption. Number two, the need for popular support makes governments underpay their office holders and their office salaries due to social jealousy and perceived income inequality. To fix this problem, he proposed, among other measures, that the salaries of ministers and senior office holders be linked in accordance with the returns of the private sector. In other words, if the economy is doing well, then the officials also do well, and if the economy suffers, then the salaries of the officials also suffer. I can't help but think that this type of policy would have had a huge impact on the decisions made by officials when they were weighing the cost benefits of shutting down local economies during COVID. In the opening preface to his book, Yu states, "We cannot afford to forget that public order, personal security, economic and social progress, and prosperity are not the natural order of things, that they depend on a ceaseless effort and attention from an honest and effective government that the people must elect." Lee Kuan Yew was the most effective builder of nations in the 20th century. He's somebody that I highly admire and respect, and if you're interested in a case study of how to turn a bad hand in the cards of life into exponential growth and prosperity, then I would highly recommend reading this book. Now, the final book in my review is a detailed personal account of what happens to a nation and to a society that forgets that progress, prosperity, and peace are not the natural order of things. It's known as the book that brought down an empire. This is the final book on my list, The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. This book revealed to the world the horrors that took place in the Soviet Union during the totalitarian and communist rule under Lenin and Stalin. It comprises 3 volumes, first published in the 1970s after being written in secret over a span of 10 years, in which Solzhenitsyn detailed his own personal experience in the gulags, or forced labor camps. He was a captain in the Soviet army during World War II and was later arrested for criticizing Stalin and the Soviet government in private letters to his colleagues. For this, he was sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag, followed by perpetual exile to Siberia. But before we go further, let's step back and take a look at the conditions in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. The ideas laid out in Marx's Communist Manifesto had taken root in Russian society. Russia's involvement in World War I at the time was very unpopular with its people, and in addition, the country was suffering from food shortages and poor living conditions. The workers blamed the rich, or the landowning class that they called kulaks, believing them to be enemies of the people's movement. In 1917, the political and social unrest between the Russian government and the Bolshevik working class led to revolutionary uprisings and the abolishment of the Russian monarchy. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party stepped in to lead a revolution that would start a civil war in Russia for the next 5 years, ending with the creation of the Soviet Union and the beginning of a new socialist regime. In his initial efforts to bring order to the new government, Lenin wrote an essay called How to Organize the Competition, in which he compiled a list of actions that needed to take place in order for true socialism to arise in Soviet society. In the essay, he proclaimed a common and united purpose of purging the Russian land of all kinds of what he called harmful insects. By insects, he meant groups in society that were considered to be enemies of the revolution. However, the circle that encompassed that group would continue to expand over time. The word kulak in Russian society originally described a miserly and dishonest trader or landowner who did not grow rich by their own labors, but instead acted as middlemen, growing rich by the work of others. But as the revolution unfolded, the term began to be used to describe all those who owned land or hired any workers at all. In the 1930s, the term was further inflated to include both farmers and peasants. And with the momentum of class guilt and its ever-expanding net, a new class of enemy was created called the podkulachnik, which were described as any person aiding the kulaks. In other words, if we consider you an enemy of the people, then that makes it so. The rise of associating guilt based on class and group identity invaded all aspects of Russian society, ranging from engineers, factory operators, members of academia, and government officials, to small children and mothers who were found scrounging individual specks of grain from harvested wheat fields just to feed their families. No one was exempt from the Gulag. There was a call for a new law and new ethical norms. The term social ally came to be widely used in the view that people were no longer seen as individuals. Instead, they were seen as carriers of specific ideas and political motivations, each involved in a winner-take-all struggle for power. The concept of guilt was an old bourgeois concept. Thieves, murderers, and criminals were not held responsible for their crimes because the fault was placed on the rich, the originators of the inequality and the social injustice that led them to commit those crimes. This contributed to the collapse of Soviet society, characterized in part by industry shutdowns and mismanagement in agriculture, leading to what is known as Holodomor, a famine in the Ukraine that contributed to the death of nearly 12 million Ukrainians. Solzhenitsyn took his time in prison to look over his life with a fine-tooth comb, to understand what had led to the current state of affairs in the Soviet Union and what role he might have played in bringing it about. He famously observed that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, class, or political parties, but through every human heart. He found that he, along with many others in Russian society, had forfeited their relationship with the truth and their own personal experience in order to bring about the socialist ideals that ultimately led to the death of an estimated 60 million people. My favorite quote from the book is, "Do not pursue what is illusory, property and position. All that is gained at the expense of your nerves, decade after decade, and is confiscated in one fell night. Live with a steady superiority over life. Don't be afraid of misfortune, and do not yearn after happiness. It is, after all the same. The bitter doesn't last forever, and the sweet never fills the cup to overflowing. It is enough if you don't freeze in the cold, and if thirst and hunger don't claw at your insides. If your back isn't broken, if your feet can walk, if both arms can bend, if both eyes can see, and if both ears hear, then whom should you envy, and why? Our envy of others devours us most of all. Rub your eyes and purify your heart, and prize above all else in the world those who love you and who wish you well. Do not hurt them or scold them, and never part from any of them in anger. After all, you simply do not know. It may be your last act." That was my list of the top 5 books that I enjoyed reading in 2020. Reading each one of these books had a major impact on my life, and I'm going to be doing many more book reviews on this channel in the future. If you have any suggestions for what I should review next, please leave me a comment to let me know. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for watching, everyone, and stay blessed.